A plane collided directly with a mountain at this exact point 52 years ago in the world's longest mountain range. Surprisingly, right after the collision, the plane disappeared. This is the Andes mountain range in South America, which is 8,900 kilometers long, where you find mountains as high as 15,000 feet, unbearable cold, and nothing but silence. For many days, when neither the wreckage of the plane nor any dead bodies were found, it became clear to the authorities that no passengers would have survived. Therefore, they announced the cessation of the search operation. In the news media, for a few days, there were talks about the plane crash, and then gradually, everything started to return to normal. People had almost forgotten about this accident. But about 2.5 months later, exactly 72 days after the incident, the authorities received a message from the missing plane. This was Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, which in real life performed a miracle, a wonder, and has forever etched its name in history. On October 12, 1972, this flight took off from the Uruguayan capital, Montevideo, carrying rugby players who were headed to Santiago, the capital of Chile, to play a match. Including the rugby players, there were a total of 40 passengers and 5 crew members on the plane. Shortly after takeoff, while the plane was still over Argentina, due to bad weather, they had to land in the city of Mendoza in Argentina. The captain made this decision because the Andes, the world's highest mountain range, stand like a wall between Argentina and Chile. The high mountains here are dangerous in themselves, and crossing them in bad weather was not without risks. The pilot's plan was to spend one night in Mendoza and then cross the Andes the next day when the weather improved. But little did the pilot and all the passengers know what calamity was about to befall them the next day. On the next day, which was Friday, 13th October, Flight 571 took off from Mendoza. Looking at the map, the distance between Mendoza and their destination Santiago is only 180 kilometers. But these 180 kilometers consist solely of the Andes' 15,000 feet high peaks. Therefore, the planned route of the flight was such that the plane would first go south of Mendoza, gain its height, and then, upon reaching parallel to the Planchon Pass, turn towards the Andes, cross these dangerous mountains, and then turn again near the city of Curicó in Chile, before landing straight in Santiago. The pilot of Flight 571 had already completed about 50 flights on this route, so he had a lot of confidence in himself. As soon as it took off from Mendoza, the plane, following the plan, headed south. During its ascent, the pilot noticed that a thick layer of clouds had obscured the view below. In this condition, the pilot established contact with the control tower, which would keep informing the pilot of his location via radio by observing the radar. Apart from the control tower, pilots can estimate their location by another method. This involves keeping in mind the aircraft's last known location and calculating the current location based on the aircraft's speed. This method is known in aviation language as dead reckoning. As soon as Flight 571 reached parallel to the Planchon Pass, they took a right turn. Now they were passing over the Andes Mountains at a height of 18,000 feet. With the blue sky above and white clouds below, the pilot was completely dependent on the Santiago Air Traffic Control Tower. As soon as they approached Planchon Pass, Flight 571 disappeared from the control tower's radar. This was normal because the mountainous terrain weakened radar signals. Now, the co-pilot used dead reckoning to calculate their location, radioed the Santiago Tower that they would reach over the city of Curicó in Chile in 1 minute, and asked for permission to decrease their altitude. Normally, it takes 11 minutes for a plane to reach Curicó from Planchon Pass, but they had covered this distance in just 3 minutes. The staff in the control tower did not understand this, but since they also did not have Flight 571 on their radar, they gave permission for the aircraft to descend. But what they didn't realize was that the co-pilot's calculation of the plane's location was wrong. The pilot thought they were over Curicó, but in reality, they were just crossing Planchon Pass. A great disaster was awaiting Flight 571. As soon as they received permission from the control tower, the pilot made a right turn and started to lower the plane's altitude. Initially, they faced dangerous turbulence, but when they crossed the layer of white clouds, what they saw in front of them was a very large mountain. Yes, at this point, the pilot realized that they were still in the Andes. The pilot made a full effort to gain altitude again. The plane's nose was now pointing towards the sky, but unfortunately, perhaps it was a bit too late. The tail of Flight 571 struck the top of the mountain and detached from the plane. At this time, the mountain was completely covered in snow. Without its tail and wings, the fuselage of Flight 571 slid down the snow, coming straight down, and stopped at this point. Due to the crash, 12 passengers died on the spot, particularly those who were in the rear part of the plane. Miraculously, 33 passengers in the plane's fuselage survived, but they were seriously injured. Due to the tail being detached, the rear part of the plane was open, and intense cold was entering. They were now stuck in the Andes at an altitude of 11,500 feet, where the temperature was 30 degrees Celsius. As soon as they stepped out, all they could see were mountains covered in snow as far as the eye could see. There were no humans, animals, or greenery in sight for miles. First, they buried the bodies of their companions in the snow outside. Meanwhile, news of the plane crash had alerted the Chilean authorities, but they were unaware that the crash had actually occurred in Argentina. Initially, the Chilean authorities started a search operation involving 4 airplanes. They searched the suspected area from morning till evening, but neither saw any plane nor found any debris. It was a very difficult search operation because the snow-covered mountains below were reflecting the light. Uruguay and Argentina also participated in this search operation, and now a total of 11 aircraft spent the whole day searching for Flight 571. Over at the crash site, many rescue planes flew over the surviving passengers. Despite their desperate signaling, the rescue planes failed to notice them. Later, they found a lipstick in one of the luggage bags with which they wrote SOS in large letters on the fuselage of the plane. They also made a cross with the luggage bags in the snow, but still, the rescue planes did not spot them. After the search operation continued for 8 days, on 21st October, all passengers were declared dead, and the search operation was terminated. On the 11th day, the passengers at the crash site found a radio in the cockpit. By tuning it, they heard the news that the search operation launched to find them had now been called off. Already in a dire situation, this news plunged them into deeper despair. The hope they had of being rescued had now vanished. In the first 5 nights alone, 5 more passengers succumbed to their injuries. Now, only 28 passengers remained at the crash site. They gathered the wreckage and luggage to seal the fuselage of the plane to protect themselves from the cold. They also cut the plastic visor of the cockpit to make glasses for themselves, which provided some protection from the light reflected off the snow. They used seat covers for warmth and turned seat cushions into snowshoes. At that point, they had only 8 chocolate bars, 3 jars of jam, some dried fruits, and a few bottles of water for food. They barely managed to divide and consume this food during the first week. But when all these items were finished, they started eating clothes and cotton, which led to them becoming more ill. In this part of the Andes, they couldn't find anything to eat for energy. Moreover, the ridge where they had crashed was impossible to descend from or hike upwards. Finally, when they could think of no other solution, they began to consume the body parts of their deceased companions. This decision was extremely difficult, but hunger, thirst, and weakness forced them to take this step. During this time, the passenger's body weight had reduced by 40%. 17 days after the crash, on the night of 29th of October, suddenly an avalanche struck, severely hitting the fuselage. The speed of the snowslide was so intense that the entire fuselage was filled with snow from the inside. In this incident, 9 survivors perished. The remaining 19 people did whatever they could to remove the snow and create space for oxygen. Days were passing, and the condition of the survivors was deteriorating. One by one, the survivors were succumbing to death, and those who remained were waiting for their own end. By 12th December, 60 days after the crash, 3 more survivors lost their battle with life. Now, the remaining 16 people had only 2 options: either to die or to muster the courage to hike the vertical cliff to the west in any way possible. On 12th of December 1972, 3 rugby players, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin, decided to hike the western peak, hoping to find a green valley on the other side where they might find some help. It was a very painful hike, as they did not have professional gear, and most importantly, the temperature was 30 degrees Celsius. They wrapped themselves in handmade sleeping bags and warm clothes made from the plane's seats and set out on the hike. After continuously hiking for 3 days, when they finally reached the top of the mountain, they saw that the other side of the mountain was also covered with snow just like this side. There was neither greenery nor any signs of life there. Due to the shortage of food, one person returned to the crash site. Parado and Canessa, in search of help, went downhill on the other side of the mountain. After trekking for the next 10 days and covering a distance of 61 kilometers in a terrible condition, they finally reached a valley where there was greenery, animals, and a flowing river. First, they drank water from the river, and then they saw a person on a horse on the other side of the river. Due to the noise of the river, they couldn't convey their message to that person. The person on the horse got an idea and threw a paper and pen wrapped around a stone across the river. Parado and Canessa wrote the whole incident on the paper and threw it back. The person on the horse rushed the letter to the Chilean authorities. At first, they couldn't believe that survivors from the plane crash could still be alive after 2.5 months. However, the authorities immediately rescued Parado and Canessa, provided them with medical care, and then took a detailed interview from them. On 22nd December, 72 days after the crash, 3 helicopters, following the directions given by Parado and Canessa, reached the crash site. The pilot was amazed to see the peak of the mountain, wondering how these 2 rugby players managed to climb it without any gear or experience. Eventually, all the remaining survivors in the fuselage were rescued, and their deceased companions were buried in a large grave at the site. Some stones were placed on the grave to create a memorial, which still remains there in the same condition. Surviving 72 days without proper food and water reminds us that if a person does not lose courage, they can overcome the greatest of adversities.